You know, in comic books, there is one character who is more mysterious, more misunderstood, and yes, maybe even more maligned than any other. And it's no character at all, it's a creator, Steve Ditko. Now, if you are not a fan of at least a certain age, Steve Ditko may be a name that you don't even recognize. But he is the amazing talent behind dozens of your favorite superheroes, not the least of which is the amazing Spider-Man. Not much is known about Steve Ditko, at least not apart from the things that everybody presumes to know about him. And that's due at least in part to the fact that Ditko, famously a recluse, steadfastly refused to grant a single interview, not from 1966, right at the dawn of organized fandom, all the way until his death in 2018. But now a fella named David Curry has attempted what probably nobody thought was even possible. He's written a biography of Steve Ditko. The result is a 144-page oversized book from Hermes Press titled Ditko Shrugged. So, how is this book? Is it any good? Is it worth your time? And more importantly, is it worth your money? That's the topic of this video. So, if you like comic books and if you like Steve Ditko, stick around. We're going to have some fun. Hey there, Bubby. Welcome to Shanghala. My name is Duke, and this is a review video. Except instead of reviewing a comic book, this time out we'll be reviewing an actual book about comics. And that book is, as we've noted, Ditko Shrugged. After first being solicited for release in July, the book got caught up in the whole COVID kerfuffle. It finally hit stands the last week of December 2020. The title is, of course, a reference to the artist's famous fascination with the works of novelist-philosopher Ayn Rand and her self-created moral code, which she dubbed Objectivism. The subtitle of the book is The Uncompromising Life of the Artist-Creator of Spider-Man and the Rise of Marvel Comics. And that may be my biggest gripe about this book. And I have a few, but the biggest is that it maybe focuses a little too much on Marvel Comics and on Stan Lee, and on frankly just about everything that ever happened in the comic book industry, and not enough on Steve Ditko. You know, Stan Lee had a rule about writing comics, and this could be one of those stories that, as Lee himself often quipped, "I've told this story so many times, for all I know, it might even be true." or it could be like the story about Joe Shuster and the ham sandwich, a tale that people like to repeat even if it's not true, just because it's so good it should be true. But anyway, Lee's rule was that in a good superhero comic book, before page 3, somebody has to slug somebody else. Well, in similar fashion, we might say that in a good biography, the subject figure would seem like a good place to start. But after a foreword by Ditko's nephew Mark Ditko, and introductions and prologues by author David Curry, once we get into the book proper, well, Curry does quickly acknowledge Ditko was born, but then spends about 8 pages detailing the early history of the comic book medium. Time he spends going on and on about Simon and Kirby and Stan Lee, and even Will Eisner, with nary a nod to Steve Ditko. And that's a pattern that repeats itself throughout this book, where Curry will take a tangent off of Ditko and into comic book lore. He says, and this does have a certain amount of validity to it, that he does this on purpose, because the history of Steve Ditko, one of the few acknowledged masters of sequential art, is, for all intents and purposes, a history of the comic book medium itself. Unfortunately, Curry gets some of that history not quite right. Most industry historians now acknowledge that the legend of how Max Gaines created the modern comic book format may be largely apocryphal, or at least credited a little too much to Gaines at the expense of others who actually had the idea. There's also the story of Marvel publisher Martin Goodman allegedly finding a closet full of rejected inventory and ordering everyone in the company laid off until Stan Lee had used it all up, given that Lee had paid for those pages. Well, like the Schuster sandwich incident, that's probably just a good story, or at least one that was highly embellished over the years. But the biggest transgression of fact is Curry's retelling of how Goodman lost his distribution deal with American News in 1957, this happening only months after Goodman closed his own in-house distribution arm, Atlas News. The loss of ANC forced Goodman to go hat in hand to DC Comics number cruncher Jack Leibowitz, who did accept Goodman's comics for distribution via DC's sister company Independent News, but ordered a strict limit on the number of Marvel comics it would carry. That resulted in Goodman having to cut his comics line by about 3/4, which further resulted in the company shriveling down to a skeleton crew of, well, pretty much Stan Lee and not much else, while Lee used up the inventory he'd commissioned before the sudden and severe cut in Marvel's output. Leibowitz limited Goodman to just 8 monthly titles. But for the sake of diversity, desperately needed to use up the leftover inventory of Marvel's genre-chasing pre-hero output, Lee remade the line into 16 bi-monthly titles, which technically limboed under Leibowitz's 8-per-month limit. Although, Goodman did test that limit from time to time. Even so, this was, by all accounts, a time when a disheartened Goodman very nearly threw in the towel on comic books, and the fact that he didn't became a seminal moment in Ditko's life. That's because he and Kirby were among the first freelancers hired back in 1959 when the inventory was used up and Lee was once again hiring. Now, but for him stepping in front of a train, it probably would have been Lee's best friend, Joe Manley, whom he'd have turned to first alongside Jack Kirby, leaving Ditko stranded over at low-paying Charlton Comics, never to be part of the Marvel explosion. So, 3 things. 1, Curry really doesn't linger over how the near collapse of Marvel affected Ditko personally or professionally, nor does he waft over how fortunate Ditko was to get his foot back in the door and how that change impacted his life and his work. It's all just another industry story Curry tells in between paragraphs that focus somewhat dryly on what Ditko is doing for work in any given year. Secondly, Curry places the infamous closet incident here, saying the inventory of rejected work is what Lee relied on to fill the truncated Marvel line from 57 to 59. But in a 2013 interview with Roy Thomas in Comic Book Artist number 2, Lee placed the closet incident a decade earlier in the late 1940s. But thirdly, and far worse, as Curry tells it, in the wake of the mid-1950s uproar over comics, caused by the U.S. Senate hearings into juvenile delinquency, ANC simply pulled the plug on that product line. Curry claims that with retailers increasingly reluctant to carry comic books, ANC sent Goodman a letter stating that his comics were, quote, no longer required. Well, I would love to see that letter, if it exists, because the history as I have it from every other source on the topic ever is that ANC was on the ropes under an antitrust investigation launched by the Federal Department of Justice. Common speculation is that this is why Goodman closed down Atlas and threw in with ANC, because it was hard up for business and probably offered him sweetheart terms. Now, as a result of the federal lawsuit, ANC was ordered to divest itself of retail outlets it owned outright. Part of the issue had been that those newsstands had refused to carry anything but ANC distributed product. In the fallout, Dell Publications, then the largest publisher of comic books in North America, left ANC, which then shut down soon thereafter. So not only does Curry never mention the ANC lawsuit, he's the only source I've ever seen anywhere to claim that just before it died, partly as a result of losing Dell, ANC elected to lose Marvel. But that aside, the problem for me as a reader, apart from any factual errors and omissions in comic book history, is that Curry rarely ties the industry milestones he ticks off in terms of how those things impacted or influenced Ditko, at least not in anything more than what feels like a very superficial way. Here and there paths cross, and there's clear cross-contamination in terms of influences, but by and large, it feels like Curry is just using these historical tangents as a way to fill space. Now, in a way, that's understandable. As I noted in the teaser, not many people would have attempted a Ditko biography at all. It's not just that Ditko left behind so little about himself personally, outside of his many screeds on Objectivism, but by dying at age 90, he also outlived just about anybody and everybody who might have spoken knowingly about him as a person. Beyond that goofy acolyte of Ayn Rand mythology in which he was draped by much of the comic book fan press before and after the rise of the internet. But even so, Curry does have at least one advantage going for him. He appears to have carried out a regular correspondence with Ditko during the artist's later years, so Curry does get to quote from these letters and even includes an image or two of Ditko's handwritten snail-mailed pages. It's worth noting, I guess, that rather through mistrust of the technology or general antipathy of all things newfangled, Ditko reportedly never owned a computer, resisting the temptation of social media right up until the bitter end. So, hey, good on him. He was smarter than the rest of us. But sadly, the Curry-Ditko letters don't reveal much about Ditko, his life, or even really his unique place at any pivotal time in the history of comics, at least not beyond confirming a lot of things we mostly already knew. Yes, they do provide some newish insight into Ditko's state of mind and ways of thinking, and given that Ditko generally refused to respond to those fans who managed to track him down and ask him questions, Curry is to be congratulated for getting what he got. But still, Ditko's taciturn replies, seemingly only a page or two at a time, convey, on the whole, the tone of an old man just on the verge of telling Curry to get the hell off his lawn. Not that Ditko had a lawn, living as he did in a small Manhattan studio space. But still, even if Ditko's air is aloof, the letters convey no sense of malice. He just seems like what he was, an old man who did not suffer fools gladly, patiently explaining things that, from his point of view, ought to have been self-evident. But the important thing, I think, is that Ditko doesn't come off at all the way he's often been portrayed online, as a crazy old coot holed up in a cave, harboring grudges against Stan Lee and Marvel and million-dollar movies that made everybody rich but him, and most especially against anyone who could not see the gray tones of the world in his own stark terms of black and white. As to the comic stuff, Ditko actually seems to pass all that off as things he had no control over. Indeed, as things that, and here's his moral philosophy at play, that he had no right to exercise control over once he turned in his pages. He did the job, he got paid, the end. On the whole, Ditko comes off not as a man mad at the world, but one who maybe simply gave up on it. Like the heroes of Randian novels, he went on strike when he parted ways with Marvel, and that was that. So, before we go any further, you probably want to know, is this book worth buying? Well, frankly, it ain't cheap. At $49.99, I'm kind of inclined to say no, it's not really worth the coin. At least not if you have anything more than a passing knowledge of comics history in general, or of Ditko in particular. The book does cover a lot of ground, but rather in its review of comics history or in its high-level summary of Ditko's life, this book really doesn't tell us much that we didn't already know, or that you couldn't uncover with a few minutes of active Googling. Even the book title, a play on the Ayn Rand novel Atlas Shrugged, is borrowed, having been used in a 2004 5-part article by Tom Young on comicsbulletin.com and in a 2017 episode of the Amazing Spider Talk podcast by Dan Gosden and Mark Ginocchio. Truth to tell, title aside, because it really is about the easiest, most on-the-nose title to pick, I am a little disappointed with this book. But then, hey, maybe I went into it with unrealistic expectations, hoping for more than anybody could possibly deliver on the enigma that is Steve Ditko. Still, Curry claims to be a journalist. I say claims only because he does not name what newspapers or other institutions he's supposed to have worked for in London during the 1980s. Now, and here's what gives me pause, Curry does name a few movies he worked on as an actor, including the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man flick in 2002. But I couldn't find his name listed anywhere on IMDb, not on Spider-Man, not on any of the movies he says he was in. So maybe his acting was as an extra? I don't know. It is indisputable, however, that Curry did write 2 books about David Bowie back in the 1980s. I found those listed on Amazon. I can't speak to how complete those books were, but as for this one, well, Curry might have come across the info needed to write this book just as easily during the 2 decades he says he owned a couple of comic book shops in Western England than he did from using any training he might have had as a journalist. See, apart from the usual stories you've heard over the years, if you are anything more than passingly familiar with the history of comic books, this book is pretty thinly sourced. Other than his own correspondences with Ditko, Curry seems to rely on only a couple of sources that he personally cultivated, such as former Timely and Marvel artist Alan Bellman from letters the two exchanged before Bellman died last year. But again, as I noted before, well, that's to be forgiven to some degree at least, given how few of Ditko's peers are still with us. Although, strangely, there does not appear to have been any attempt on Curry's part to interview Robin Snyder, Ditko's self-publishing partner for the last 20 years or so of his life. Curry also doesn't interview any surviving Ditko family members. In his foreword, Mark Ditko says he was excited when he learned about this book and that he reviewed it for accuracy regarding his family, but he does not appear to have contributed to the actual text in any substantial way. Beyond his foreword, there's no reminiscing from Mark Ditko about his uncle, no information from his perspective on his uncle's strict moral philosophy, why it appealed to him or how he developed and adapted it to comic book storytelling, or even what he may have said over the years about his experiences in and out of comics. That seems to me to be a significant failing. As I say, there's precious little in this book outside of information already widely available on the internet. Apart from Curry's letters to and from Ditko, there seems to be almost nothing done in the way of original research. Now, Curry does say that Ditko died with an estate worth roughly $1 million, which would indicate that Ditko lived as frugally as he apparently did, largely by choice, not, as conventional wisdom would have it, because he was a penniless pauper who enjoyed zero income from his creations beyond that original page rate. But does he appear to have been given any opportunity to review whatever Ditko may have left behind in his small, almost closet-like Manhattan studio, where I think we can still presume Ditko also lived? There is nothing in this book from Ditko's own personal papers and effects, assuming any even exist, that gives us additional insight into his unique mind. I mean, don't get me wrong, all of the usual stories are here in this book. There's the one about how Ditko ended up replacing Jack Kirby on the creation of Spider-Man after apparently being given Kirby pages to ink and then pointing out to Lee how similar Kirby's concept was to one of his prior co-creations, The Fly. Curry discusses the existence of the Ben Cooper Spider-Man costume that predated Marvel Spider-Man yet was eerily similar to Ditko's costume design, a thing that some people have tried to manipulate into a black eye on Ditko's reputation as a creator and designer. There is a review of Stan Lee's margin notes on the original artboards for the first Spider-Man story in Amazing Fantasy number 15, now held by the Library of Congress, with discussion of where Ditko obeyed and where he disregarded Lee's change orders to the pencil work. And Curry does address and rightfully debunks the long-held fandom belief that Ditko quit Spider-Man because of a disagreement with Lee over the secret identity of the Green Goblin. So it's all here, but again, it's all background broken online over the past couple of decades. This book really gives us nothing new despite Curry's access to Ditko and the Ditko family. Curry doesn't venture anywhere the stories already in circulation haven't already tread. There's no discussion of what impact Ditko's studio mate, fetish artist Eric Stanton, might have had on him, not beyond a quick denial that Stanton had any hand in contributing to Spidey's creation. There's no discussion of Ditko's personal life. Did he ever have even a single relationship of any kind? There's an overview of Objectivism and some passages on how Ditko interpreted it, but almost nothing on why and how it appealed to him and how it affected his working relationships after Stan Lee. And it's not like Jim Shooter and others don't have those tales to tell. We get lots of what Ditko did and where, but not a lot to speak of on his actual working methods. And apart from the widely acclaimed lift scene from Amazing Spider-Man 33 or quotes on the trippiness of his Doctor Strange work, there's almost no critical review of Ditko's strengths in pacing and panel-to-panel continuity, the sheer mastery in storytelling of leading the reader's eye. Again, apart from quoting existing widely available sources, there's nothing in this book from experts taking a fresh, critical examination of Ditko's work, what made his style so special and how it changed over the years. Now, that said, I shouldn't imply there's nothing new in this book. There were a couple of tidbits that were new to me anyway. One was the revelation that when Ditko returned to the comics industry in 1955 after nearly a year of convalescing from tuberculosis, he could not get any work from Charlton Comics, which had recently seen its printing and production offices flooded out by Hurricane Diane. And when work did come from Charlton, it was at a reduced rate, and that helped drive Ditko to Stan Lee's office door, where he'd find work for a year or so before the ANC collapse. And that helped get his foot in the door, having apparently impressed Lee enough that he was at the front of the line when Lee resumed hiring in 1959. And that sets up a weird what-if that might have been worth spending some time on. After all, had Ditko been able to pick up right where he had left off with Charlton before the tuberculosis illness, he might not have been as readily available to Lee, proving his abilities in all those Monster of the Week yarns for several years prior to the birth of the Marvel Universe. It's an imponderable alt history, much like the old chestnut about what if Joe Manley hadn't fallen in front of that train. The Marvel Universe might have looked much different if Lee had his best friend Manley to lean on when superheroes came back in fashion, if indeed the Marvel Universe would have come about at all. The book also contains a few quotes about Ditko that I had not seen before from his School of Visual Arts mentor, Jerry Robinson. Robinson, as you may know, is perhaps best known for his work ghosting Bob Kane on Batman. And those bits, those quotes, that was nice. That gave a little bit of a fresh perspective on Ditko. I also had not realized before reading this book just how much Wally Wood despised Stan Lee and how simpatico Wood and Ditko were on that front, nor of the purported closeness between the two artists in their post-Marvel years, despite their differing political and social views. But maybe the one real eye-popper for me was also the most frustrating. In this book, Curry claims it was actually Stan Lee who introduced Ditko to the works of Ayn Rand. That would seem to be a huge revelation, if true, given the impact Rand had on Ditko's later life and career, and the wedge adherence to her objectivist worldview allegedly drove between himself and Stan Lee. But Curry provides no source or citation for the claim. And leading up to the Lee-Ditko divorce, Curry writes, quote, having first discovered her work in the early 1960s, ironically through Stan Lee, who took particular note of the writer's definition of a hero, Ditko was now immersing himself and intellectually embracing the objectivist philosophy postulated by Russian-born Rand, whose novel Atlas Shrugged had become a widely read bestseller in a 1963 paperback reissue edition. That's quite a sentence. And I mean, it's quite a sentence for its construction as much as for its content. It's one of the things that makes me wonder where and for how long Curry actually worked as a journalist. This is not exactly tight writing. The book also is not very closely edited, I must say. Just in that one kind of run-on sentence I just read to you, we have a missing comma to start off the parenthetical element that begins, who took particular note. We have a compound adjective, widely read, that's missing its hyphen, and the decampment of that missing hyphen over to bestseller, which, not being a compound adjective, should be hyphen-free. There's actually a fair number of typos in this book, frankly. I mean, there's no real actual misspellings that I saw, but just lots of weirdly placed commas and occasionally places where a word seems to have just dropped out of a sentence or other weird punctuation with hyphens and colons. There's also a lot of run-on sentences and places that clearly should have been the start of a new paragraph that, again, well, not technically wrong, just stuck out stylistically to me, and they just bugged me. But I don't know, maybe that's based on my own 15 years as a reporter on weekly newspapers here in Maine. Speaking of style, the other thing that annoyed me was how Curry would reference his letters from Ditko, swinging seemingly at random between the professorial, as he told this author, or wrote to this author, to the comparatively folksy, as he told me. It's like Bub Picklane. But getting back to the claim that it was Stan Lee who turned Ditko on to Ayn Rand, that could be potentially a paradigm shift in how we understand both Ditko and Lee, together as a creative team and separately as men. I mean, this idea that Lee was enamored by, or at least interested in how Rand defined a hero, when in every interview he ever gave, Lee claimed to just not get Ditko's objectivist philosophy at all, it's kind of stunning. And given how they reportedly feuded over both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, particularly in terms of how Peter Parker should mature into a hero's moral posture, the very idea that Lee and Ditko were, for a time at least, if not on the same page, at least reading out of the same book, that's mind-bending. It alters our perceptions in no less a way than Gerard Jones did in his book Men of Tomorrow. Subtitled Gangsters, Geeks, and the Birth of the American Comic Book, Jones hipped us all to the fact that the father of Superman creator Jerry Siegel died of a heart attack suffered during a robbery of his used clothing store, a robbery that was never solved. In just the same way, that story turns on a dime our understanding of how and why Siegel created his great champion of justice. We can't help but pause over how, at one time, Lee and Ditko were not just consigned to work-related story conferences, but actually spent enough personal time together to discuss favorite reading material, where they may well have been on the verge of having the same kind of close friendship Lee had enjoyed with Manley before the latter's untimely death. Was part of Lee's rapidly apparent, if mostly understated, frustration with Ditko, not to mention the passive-aggressive ways he treated his co-creator, due to the fact that Ditko took Rand too closely to heart, while Lee's interest was maybe more utilitarian, in the way a writer might use an astrological chart to help map out a character, but not actually believe in astrology? We don't know. At present, we can't know, and Curry seems to have missed the absolutely gobsmacking significance of this particular nexus point, as he quickly chucks it aside and moves on to quoting other stories about Lee and Ditko and comic book history. Which is another problem for me. Time and again in this book, Curry puts some claim or story or opinion in quotes, but then never tells us where that phrase comes from or who said it. Once again, as a former journalist myself, that's a big problem for me. But as I hope I have by now made clear, the function of this book seems mostly to gather into one place all of the extant stories about Ditko so that you don't have to spend all that time Googling it up yourself. So in that regard, the book is a success. If that's all it meant to do, round of applause, job done. And while I may seem to have been hard in this review on the book and on Curry, this is not a bad book at all. Most of the style issues are things that kept me personally from ever sinking fully into the narrative, but they're things the typical reader might well pass over with nary a second thought. And while I've said this book offered me almost nothing new, that's partly because I've been an active collector and student of comic books for close to 50 years. However, for anyone who is not familiar with all of the stories contained between the covers of Curry's tome, it actually could be a very good and useful primer. There's plenty of examples of Ditko's art, both printed and scanned from original boards, and while there may not be as much discussion and debate about Ditko's work as I might like, too few interviews with experts and critics and historians in the field, and no detailed bibliography, Curry nonetheless provides more than enough that anyone reading this book is bound to come away with a greater appreciation of the artist, or at least of the art, than they had going in. It's just that for me, or for fans like me, this book just doesn't seem worth $50. So I desperately wish that it had been put out at about half that price, because $50 is a cost of entry that I can't help but presume will keep away most of the people to whom this book would have proven an interesting read and a useful resource. At $20 or $25, this book would have been a great general interest book. Even at $50, I'm a big enough fan of Steve Ditko that I'm not sorry I bought it, even if I have already read practically everything in it from various sources online and in the fan press. For fans like me, I just feel like a book on Ditko should have taken a more, let's call it, scholarly approach, both in chasing down Ditko's importance as an artist and his quirks as a person. So, bottom line, this is not the definitive biography of Steve Ditko, but it is the bio we have right now, and more likely than not, it's the only one we're bound to have for some time. So, enjoy the book. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe, do all the groovy things, and until the next video, goodbye, good luck, and please be good to each other.